I adjusted my napkin one last time, smoothing out the crease that had somehow stubbornly remained since morning. Lunch had always felt like a small performance, one where I was expected to smile politely and nod in agreement while everyone else directed the conversation. Today was no different, yet beneath my calm exterior, a quiet storm was brewing. The mention of "you should gift the condo now" hit me like a slow, heavy wave, the kind that lingers, making you question if what you've done all these years was ever truly noticed. I could feel their eyes skimming over me, anticipation wrapped in expectation, as though my choices were no longer my own. This is just the beginning of my story. Tell me, have you ever felt like the very people who claim to love you are blind to what truly matters, pushing you to act in ways you never intended? I took a slow breath, savoring the last bite of my salad, the mundane act feeling suddenly significant. I realized in that moment that the story they thought they were writing for me was about to take a turn they could never predict. After lunch ended, I found myself lingering at the table longer than necessary, letting the remnants of their chatter fade into background noise. My mind wasn't on the dessert or the coffee they poured automatically. It was on their words, heavy and casual, like a command I had no right to question. They hadn't asked me how I felt, or if I was ready. They hadn't considered that the condo wasn't just a piece of property to me, but a collection of memories, small victories, and quiet corners that held decades of my life. It was clear they assumed ownership of my choices, as if my decisions belonged to the family ledger they kept in their heads. I took a slow walk after leaving the restaurant, the late spring air brisk against my cheeks. Each step felt deliberate, a silent argument with their expectations. I remembered when I first purchased the condo, how proud I had been of that moment of independence, of finally having a space that belonged entirely to me. My thoughts wandered through each memory, the peeling paint I had restored myself, the small kitchen garden I tended on weekends, the evenings spent with a book in hand while the city hummed softly below. It wasn't just real estate. It was a testament to years of effort, patience, and self-reliance. And yet, today, all of that seemed invisible to them, as though my life had been nothing more than an account balance waiting to be dispersed. Their suggestion had felt casual, but betrayal often wears a calm mask. I imagined the scene in my mind, their polite smiles, the slight nods, the way they expected me to comply without question. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a challenge, a subtle accusation that I wasn't acting in alignment with what they thought I should. In that quiet moment after lunch, I realized that their vision of me, compliant, generous, and unquestioning, was one I had outgrown long ago. I had been patient, accommodating, and forgiving, but no one had asked if those gestures were meant to benefit me or if they were only appreciated when they served someone else. I walked past the familiar streets near my condo, noticing the small changes the neighborhood had undergone, new shops replacing old ones, trees that had grown taller than I remembered. Everything around me seemed to be evolving, moving forward without my permission, much like my family's expectations. And yet, within me, a different kind of movement was beginning, a quiet, deliberate planning, a consideration of what it truly meant to have ownership over one's life. Their words had lit a spark, but it wasn't anger. It was clarity. Clarity that my autonomy mattered, that my decisions were not subject to public commentary. As I approached the building, I paused at the door, a wave of reflection washing over me. It occurred to me that the condo represented not just a home, but a silent ledger of every sacrifice and choice I had made. From late-night hours fixing plumbing issues to negotiating tricky contracts, the condo had been my project, my challenge, and my reward. And now, sitting in my car just steps away, I felt a shift. I was no longer the person who would quietly bend to familial pressure. Their lunch suggestion was not a request, it was a prompt. I had a decision to make, one that would define not just the day, but the respect they would learn to afford me. The thought of gifting the condo to someone outside of their awareness came to me almost effortlessly. Someone they had overlooked, someone who had always existed in the background of my life, yet never been considered in family calculations. My mind rehearsed the possibilities, weighing the subtle implications of this move. How would they react if the tables were turned? If the invisible became central and their carefully constructed expectations crumbled under a decision that I alone would make? I felt no malice, only the satisfaction of asserting my own voice, one that had been quieted far too long. I remembered my conversations with this person over the years, shared moments of understanding, gestures of quiet support. They had been there when no one else noticed, offering a hand without expectation. And now, they would be the recipient of my choice, my gift, my declaration that my life, my property, and my agency were not subject to the approval of anyone else. The thought of their gratitude brought a calm smile to my lips, a gentle reassurance that, while betrayal can sting, empowerment carries a weight far more satisfying. That evening, I sat in the condo, letting the sun fall across the living room floor, imagining the steps I would take. I thought about the paperwork, the timing, the formalities, and most importantly, the impact. This wasn't an act of revenge, but of realignment, showing that respect, consideration, and recognition are not automatic. They are earned, even within a family. The lunch suggestion had been the catalyst, but the decision belonged solely to me. I felt a sense of liberation, the kind that doesn't arrive in storms or shouts, but quietly, through deliberate action and unwavering clarity. By the time night fell, I had a plan in mind. I would gift the condo not in secrecy, but with precision, fully aware, fully intentional, and fully free from the burden of expectation. Their oversight would become irrelevant, a small footnote in a story I was determined to write on my own terms. The weight of years of silent acquiescence began to lift, replaced with a quiet but steady confidence. The condo, once a symbol of effort and autonomy, was now poised to become a declaration of dignity and self-respect, and no lunch conversation would dictate its fate. The next morning, I woke with a quiet sense of determination that seemed to settle in my chest like a solid weight. The memory of their words at lunch still lingered, persistent as a low hum in the background of my thoughts. Their suggestion to gift the condo now had been delivered with a casual, almost offhanded ease, as if it were nothing more than a passing idea. But the truth was, it had unearthed a simmering tension I had long buried. The feeling of being seen, but not truly considered, of being assumed to act in ways that only served the expectations of others. I poured myself coffee and sat by the window, watching the morning light crawl along the streets below, thinking about the precise steps I would take to reclaim control over my decisions. I revisited the documents tucked safely in my desk drawer, the official records of ownership and past renovations, and for the first time in years, I read through each one carefully with an eye toward intention rather than obligation. Every clause, every signature, every notarized note Becky, aim more than legal text. It was evidence of the life I had built and the autonomy I had always carried silently. I realized that my choice to give or withhold this gift was more than a decision about property. It was a declaration of agency, a way to assert that my life and my resources were not at the whim of someone else's suggestion. The realization brought a quiet clarity that steadied my resolve. The condo would go to someone, but only on my terms. As I moved through the rooms, memories surfaced with surprising clarity. The living room where I had hosted small gatherings, the balcony where I had spent late evenings watching the city lights flicker, the kitchen counters that had seen countless attempts at perfecting recipes, all of it reminded me that this space had been my canvas. I thought of the people who had truly recognized me, not the ones who simply claimed entitlement. They had existed in my life quietly, observing my struggles, supporting without comment, offering loyalty that did not need to be announced. My mind returned to one person in particular, someone whose presence had been constant, yet overlooked by the family hierarchy. They had been there when my patience was tested, when my decisions seemed invisible. And now it was time to honor that loyalty with a gesture that carried both gratitude and quiet defiance. The idea of gifting the condo to this person began to crystallize into a deliberate plan. I considered the timing, the paperwork, the official steps required to make the transfer effective and undeniable. but alongside the practicalities, I felt a surge of satisfaction at the thought of their surprise. They would be recognized, finally, for their consistency and presence, the very things my family had failed to see. It wasn't about making anyone else look foolish. It was about asserting that recognition and respect are earned, that my decisions are not negotiable, and that loyalty and awareness matter more than inherited expectation. Each thought built on the last, constructing a quiet but firm blueprint for the gift that would soon take shape. The evening arrived, and with it a subtle tension that hovered over the condo. I found myself revisiting small corners of the home, imagining the narrative I was about to create. Each room seemed to reflect my internal state. The kitchen echoed the preparation I had done in thought. The living room mirrored the deliberation. The balcony captured the anticipation. I kept returning to the idea that control over my life wasn't about holding grudges or orchestrating revenge. It was about making deliberate choices that respected my past, acknowledged those who mattered, and subtly illuminated the inattentiveness of others. The condo, once simply a structure of bricks and mortar, had transformed in my mind into a stage for a lesson in respect and recognition. I drafted notes and made phone calls, ensuring that every step of the legal process would be clear and legitimate. I double-checked every detail, from signatures to dates, ensuring that the gift would withstand scrutiny without leaving room for misinterpretation. The thought that this person, previously invisible to the rest of my family, would suddenly find themselves in possession of something significant brought a smile that was quiet but resolute. There was no malice in my plan, only the satisfaction of acting with intention and integrity. For the first time in months, the sense of obligation I carried toward others felt lighter, replaced by a firm sense of ownership over my choices and a subtle pride in executing them without compromise. Late into the night, I reflected on what this decision truly meant. It wasn't about the condo itself, or even about the value it represented. It was about asserting the principle that my life, my property, and my decisions are ultimately mine to govern. The memory of their casual expectation at lunch had become a catalyst, prompting an action that was measured, deliberate, and empowering. I felt a shift within myself, a recognition that subtle defiance can coexist with gratitude, that asserting boundaries can carry beauty and purpose. My gaze settled on the quiet apartment, and I felt a deep sense of calm, knowing that when the morning arrived, my plan would be ready to unfold and the world would have to acknowledge the consequences of having underestimated me. I fell asleep with the thought lingering that autonomy is not given, it is claimed, and when it is claimed thoughtfully, it reshapes relationships, reveals truths, and honors those whose presence has been constant but invisible. My heart was steady, my mind clear, and the path forward illuminated by the quiet certainty of deliberate action. The condo would go to someone deserving, someone who had always mattered but never been seen, and in doing so, I would reclaim the respect and dignity that had long been taken for granted. The stage was set, the players known, and the first steps of the plan ready to be executed. The next morning, I felt a quiet electricity in the apartment. The condo had never seemed so alive, though the walls were still the same, the sunlight still spilling lazily across the floor. Something had shifted within me overnight. The act of deciding who would receive it had changed me. I thought about the family, the words they had casually tossed at lunch as if I were some passive instrument. Their expectation that I would hand over my property without question left a taste in my mouth I couldn't ignore. As I moved around, making final notes and ensuring the documents were in perfect order, I felt the weight of their assumption pressing down, unspoken yet heavy, like a shadow following me into every room. I recalled the conversations, the sly comment, ants over dinner, the half-smiles that suggested entitlement, not appreciation. It had been subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but when I sat down and really thought about it, the pattern was clear. They believed the condo was theirs to command before I had even made a thought about it. That assumption alone sparked something deeper than irritation. It sparked resolve. My plan wasn't just about giving the property. It was about setting a boundary, about demonstrating that my decisions were mine to make, and my loyalty would be rewarded on my terms, not theirs. I began reviewing every legal document with the meticulous care of someone preparing for battle. There was a rhythm to it that both calmed and energized me. Each signature, each clause, each date mattered. This wasn't just about transferring ownership. It was about asserting that the rules of respect applied to me just as much as anyone else. I thought of the person I had chosen to gift the condo to, someone who had never demanded recognition but had earned it quietly over the years. They would be shocked, perhaps even incredulous. But in that shock lay a kind of justice that didn't need to be spoken aloud. I smiled to myself, imagining their surprise and the subtle ripple it would send through my family. By midday, I had prepared a small folder, carefully arranged with copies of all necessary documents, notarized and certified. Everything was in order, leaving no room for disputes or questions. I walked through the condo once more, envisioning the upcoming events, imagining reactions not in anger but in quiet astonishment. Their casual insistence that I act immediately had inadvertently fueled my determination. I understood now that the real power wasn't in the property itself, but in the autonomy of making a deliberate, considered choice. The condo had become more than walls and windows. It was a symbol of self-respect and an instrument of revelation. The moment for action arrived, and I called the person I had long considered the quiet constant in my life. There was hesitation on both sides, a kind of disbelief in what was about to happen. I explained calmly, carefully, the steps we would take together, ensuring everything was legitimate, official, and irreversible. As I spoke, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease, replaced with a subtle excitement. Not the thrill of revenge, but the satisfaction of integrity executed. The anticipation built with each word, and yet the quiet acknowledgement that the family had overlooked this person all these years added an extra layer of satisfaction. They had assumed my generosity would default to their expectations, but this choice defied that assumption elegantly. As the afternoon wore on, the process began. Signatures were collected, documents verified, and the final notarization completed. Each action felt like a quiet rebellion, a series of small but deliberate movements that asserted control over my own life. I thought of my family again, imagining the moment they would realize that the condo had been gifted, not to the obvious heirs but to someone they had long ignored. Their surprise was almost tangible, a tension I could feel even without them in the room. It wasn't about humiliation or punishment, it was about demonstrating that choices, recognition, and respect are never to be assumed. They are earned. By early evening, the transfer was complete. I sat in the living room, letting the events settle around me, reflecting on the quiet power of deliberate action. The condo, once just a property, now carried a narrative, a statement about value, loyalty, and unseen presence. I thought about the family, about the expectations they had held so casually, and I realized that the real lesson wasn't theirs to learn. It was mine to enact. I had taken an ordinary suggestion from Lou, Inc., and transformed it into an assertion of self-respect, acknowledgement, and quiet justice. The weight that had pressed down on me for years had shifted. It was no longer about entitlement or expectation, but about the consequences of neglect and inattentiveness. As night fell, I stood on the balcony, looking at the city lights, and felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in a long time. The apartment, once a stage of silent tension, now felt like a canvas of clarity. The person I had gifted the condo to had been acknowledged, and in doing so I had reinforced my own boundaries, celebrated loyalty, and quietly reshaped the expectations of those who had overlooked the significance of my choices. There was no grand confrontation yet, but the knowledge that the action was taken, official and irrevocable, carried a satisfaction deeper than any immediate reaction could provide. In that quiet moment, I understood the profound impact of agency and deliberate intention, a lesson written into the very walls of the condo I had claimed as a symbol of recognition, respect, and subtle empowerment. The next morning, I sensed a change in the air before any words were spoken. Even as I brewed my coffee, the silence seemed heavier, filled with anticipation. I knew the family would notice something was different, though they had no idea the full extent of what had happened. Their casual assumptions at lunch, the notion that I would hand over the condo to whoever they expected, had set the stage for a revelation they weren't prepared to face. I couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction at the thought of their impending surprise, a subtle thrill that had nothing to do with malice, but everything to do with justice in its understated form. As I scrolled through messages and glanced at the phone, I realized the first reactions were trickling in. Brief, hesitant texts, attempts at casual conversation that hid confusion and maybe a touch of panic. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I allowed a small pause, relishing the space between action and recognition. It wasn't cruelty. It was the natural consequence of overlooking someone who deserved attention all along. Every overlooked detail, every assumption of entitlement had now been inverted. The condo's transfer had become a quiet mirror, reflecting back the oversight they had taken for granted. I allowed myself a moment to breathe, feeling the depth of this small yet profound victory. By mid-morning, the phone calls started. I answered calmly, each conversation a delicate dance of neutrality and subtle tension. They tried to sound casual, almost unaware, but I could hear the undercurrent of disbelief. Questions were veiled as suggestions, gentle probing, as if they were testing the boundaries of my decision. I maintained my composure, giving nothing away. My voice was measured, polite, even warm, but the firmness in my words left no room for negotiation. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about clarity. The condo had been gifted, the papers signed, and the choice irrevocable. I could sense their minds spinning, piecing together the reality they had long assumed would never arrive. I spent the afternoon walking through the neighborhood, reflecting on the family dynamics that had led to this moment. Subtle patterns of entitlement, casual disregard, and unearned confidence had all contributed to a sense of inevitability that I was now actively dismantling. As I passed familiar streets, memories flickered, birthday dinners overlooked, conversations ignored, moments where my voice had been sidelined. Each recollection reinforced the quiet satisfaction that comes from reclaiming agency. The condo wasn't just a gift to someone who had been invisible. It was a declaration of boundaries, a demonstration that recognition is earned, not assumed. My thoughts lingered on the irony. In their assumption that I would act predictably, they had underestimated the power of deliberate choice. Evening arrived, bringing with it a series of visits from those closest to me. I greeted them warmly, though I noticed the subtle hesitation in their posture, the flickers of doubt in their eyes. Small talk felt strained, the underlying tension palpable. I could sense their minds racing, trying to reconstruct the events they had taken for granted. Each glance, each carefully measured comment revealed their struggle to reconcile expectation with reality. I observed quietly, offering no hints beyond what was necessary, allowing the discomfort to settle naturally. This was a lesson in presence, in subtle authority, in the quiet assertion of self-determination. Later, as the night deepened, I found myself reflecting on the person who had received the condo. Their quiet gratitude, mixed with astonishment, created a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold expectations of my family. I realized that their acknowledgement, their appreciation, was far more rewarding than any approval I might have sought from those who had assumed entitlement. It was a reminder that respect and recognition, when given genuinely, carry a weight far heavier than any casual expectation. I felt the significance of my choice resonate within me, a sense of alignment between intention and action, a harmony between principle and execution. Throughout the evening, subtle signs of the family's internal unrest became more apparent. Hints of whispered conversations, sudden phone glances, and tentative questions revealed their confusion, and perhaps even their embarrassment. Yet there was no confrontation, no accusations. Only the slow dawning of awareness that they had misjudged the situation, misjudged me, and misjudged the person now entrusted with the condo. I observed quietly, noting, the shift in energy, the realignment of assumptions. This moment, filled with understated tension, had a kind of poetic justice. They had acted as if my decisions would default to their desires, only to find those desires quietly redirected in a way that reflected integrity and acknowledgement rather than entitlement. By night's end, I settled into the quiet of the condo, reflecting on the days unfolding. I recognized that this was just the beginning, that the ripples of the choice I had made would continue to spread. The family's reaction was a living testament to the power of intentional action, to the significance of recognizing those who had long been overlooked. I felt a profound sense of calm, a sense of completion in a process that had begun with a simple yet powerful assertion of autonomy. The condo, once merely a property, had transformed into a symbol of subtle empowerment, respect, and justice. In that quiet space, I understood that the true impact of my decision extended far beyond the physical transfer of ownership. It reached into the very dynamics of recognition, respect, and presence that defined my relationships. The following morning, the quiet tension from the night before lingered like a shadow across the condo. I woke with a sense of purpose, knowing the family would inevitably confront the outcome of my decision sooner or later. There was no malice in me, only the firm knowledge that their assumptions had no bearing on my choices. As I brewed coffee and listened to the soft hum of the morning, I reflected on the conversations that had begun to ripple through our network of relations. Every text, call, and tentative approach hinted at the mix of disbelief, frustration, and perhaps even grudging respect they were slowly processing. I decided to take a walk, partly to clear my mind and partly to let the family stew in their thoughts. The streets were familiar, lined with trees whose shadows stretched long in the morning light. I thought about the nature of expectation, how often people assume compliance simply because it is convenient for them. Their assumption that I would act predictably had underestimated the power of deliberate choice, a principle I had relied on many times in the past. With each step, I felt the quiet affirmation that this decision, seemingly small, carried weight far beyond the exchange of property. It was a statement of agency, of control over my life, and of recognition for someone overlooked for far too long. By mid-morning, subtle confrontations began to surface. A cousin dropped by unexpectedly, ostensibly for a casual visit, but it was clear they were fishing for information. I greeted them with warmth, yet I could feel the careful calculation behind every word, every gesture. They tried to coax a hint from me, probing with hypotheticals and indirect questions. I maintained my composure, giving only measured responses. This was not about winning arguments. It was about embodying clarity and calm, letting the truth speak for itself while they grappled with the reality. Their faces betrayed the cognitive dissonance of someone confronting a world that didn't bend to their assumptions. Later, I received a call from an older family member, someone whose voice carried the authority of long-standing expectations. They spoke carefully, as though balancing curiosity and restraint. I listened, acknowledging their words without conceding any point of uncertainty. Their frustration was palpable, but it was layered with something subtler, an unspoken recognition that I had acted with intentionality rather than caprice. I could sense their mind reconstructing the narrative they had taken for granted, struggling to reconcile prior assumptions with current reality. It was a delicate dance of acknowledgement and subtle discomfort, and I remained an observer, but letting the weight of their realization unfold naturally. By noon, the ripple effect had begun to expand beyond immediate family. Messages came from friends and distant relatives, a mixture of inquiry and veiled judgment. I replied sparingly, letting the pattern of recognition and oversight establish itself. It was fascinating to observe the network of assumptions unraveling. What had seemed a simple act of gifting a condo had revealed deeper dynamics. Who noticed, who assumed, and who had remained blind to details that mattered. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not rooted in triumph over others, but in the alignment between intention and outcome. The afternoon brought a surprise visit from the person who now officially held the condo. Their gratitude was understated yet profound, a quiet affirmation of recognition that the family had failed to provide. We spoke at length about the small, overlooked elements that had mattered most, the moments when acknowledgement had been absent, the casual dismissals, the assumptions of entitlement. I realized that this was more than a legal or financial transaction. It was an emotional recalibration, a recognition of presence, value, and trust. The contrast between their appreciation and the family's disbelief was striking, and I allowed myself a brief moment to savor it without arrogance. Evening arrived, bringing with it subtle signs of tension from the family that could no longer be ignored. A relative stopped by under the pretense of casual conversation, but their eyes were sharp, their questions pointed. I responded calmly, listening more than speaking, letting the quiet of my measured presence communicate more than words ever could. They floundered slightly, realizing that the condo's fate was settled and that the expectation of influence they once held had vanished. I saw in their expressions the dawning comprehension of oversight and the consequences of assuming authority without accountability. Later that night, as I reflected on the day, I understood the layers of emotional complexity in this scenario. The family had assumed compliance, the person receiving the condo had assumed invisibility, and I had navigated the space between with quiet intention. The condo, once just a property, had become a symbol of respect, recognition, and deliberate choice. I felt a profound alignment between my actions and my principles, and I recognized the subtle power in acting with both clarity and compassion. The day had been a testament to the impact of deliberate decisions, the value of noticing those often overlooked, and the quiet assertion of boundaries that reinforce self-respect and fairness. By the end of the night, the house settled into a calm that contrasted sharply with the earlier tensions. I realized this was far from the end. The ripples would continue, the family would eventually adjust, and the significance of the choice I had made would slowly permeate our interactions. Yet in this moment, there was satisfaction in knowing that agency, recognition, and intentional action had created a balance that words alone could not convey. I felt the quiet strength of having acted in accordance with my values, honoring those who had long been ignored, and redefining expectations without a single confrontation. The morning after the ripple of revelations began to settle, I found myself anticipating the next wave. Family calls had been sparse overnight, but I sensed that quiet days often precede the most intense confrontations. The condo had changed hands, but the invisible weight of expectation lingered in every conversation I hadn't yet had. As I poured a cup of tea, I thought about how easily assumptions can cloud judgment. They had expected compliance, and now they were learning the cost of underestimating both my resolve and the value of recognizing those overlooked. The morning sunlight spilling across the floor seemed almost ironic, warm and indifferent as the storm of family tension quietly gathered around me. I decided to take a slow walk through the neighborhood, partly for clarity and partly to witness life moving without my interference. There were familiar faces nodding as I passed, unaware of the internal upheaval I carried. It struck me that while family expectations often feel pressing, the world outside continues with remarkable indifference. That indifference had a curious power. It reminded me that the decisions we make for integrity and recognition carry meaning independent of others' assumptions. As I walked, I considered the moments that had led here, the repeated suggestions to act one way, the unspoken pressures, and the subtle dismissal of voices that mattered less in the family hierarchy. Each memory reinforced the quiet satisfaction I felt in honoring someone forgotten. By mid-morning, messages began trickling in, some filled with veiled criticism, others with questions meant to probe the implications of my decision. I responded cautiously, aware that my words would be scrutinized for intent. Every reply required careful thought. It wasn't enough to be correct legally or financially. I needed to communicate without feeding the expectation that I could be coerced emotionally. I realized that restraint itself could be an instrument of clarity, a way of asserting agency without confrontation. The family's discomfort was palpable in their questions and half-phrased statements, each one betraying the assumption that my actions were negotiable, when in truth, they were final. By afternoon, one of the older relatives arrived unannounced, their demeanor polite but probing. The conversation began with casual topics, yet the underlying tension was unavoidable. They tested me with hypotheticals, attempting to uncover a reason or a flaw in my judgment. I listened carefully, responding with calm, reflective answers, allowing them to realize that the condo's transfer was complete and deliberate. Their attempts to shift the narrative faltered as I maintained an unshakable presence. In that quiet exchange, I noticed a subtle shift in their tone. an acknowledgement that their assumptions were being dismantled, not through argument, but through deliberate action and composure. Later in the evening, I reflected on the broader implications. The condo was more than property. It was a symbol of recognition, an emblem of the consequences of overlooking those who quietly deserve acknowledgement. I thought about the person I had gifted it to, whose gratitude had been understated yet profoundly moving. Their presence was a quiet affirmation that deliberate choice could correct oversights and reshape relationships without aggression. It reminded me that fairness and recognition often carry a deeper weight than power or authority, and that acting with intent can reveal truths that words alone cannot convey. As night approached, subtle disturbances began to surface. Other relatives, previously passive, started sending messages and making indirect inquiries. I noticed the underlying fear of unpredictability, a realization that family hierarchies and assumed authority were not absolute. This tension was not anger alone, it was the discomfort of a network forced to reconsider long-held assumptions. I responded minimally, allowing silence to speak where words could escalate tension unnecessarily. It was a deliberate strategy, one that created space for reflection rather than immediate reaction. The quiet hours of the evening provided a moment for introspection. I thought about the ways families often operate under unspoken rules, the expectation that compliance is easier than challenge. By gifting the condo to someone they had neglected to consider, I had disrupted this assumption, creating a ripple that would continue through future interactions. I felt a red sense of accomplishment, not in defiance, but in restoring balance and recognition to someone who had been consistently overlooked. The act itself was small in material terms, but immense in relational and emotional significance. Before sleep, I reflected on how anticipation and expectation shape human behavior. The family had expected predictability, and the person now recognized had experienced validation. I realized that the day had not only reinforced the consequences of assumptions, but had also highlighted the quiet power of deliberate choice. The condo's transfer was a catalyst, forcing reflection and recalibration, and I felt a calm assurance that my actions were aligned with principles of fairness, dignity, and recognition. It was a night of quiet satisfaction, tempered with awareness that tomorrow would bring further reactions, each layer of response deepening the consequences of a decision made with care and clarity. The morning arrived with a sense of tension I couldn't shake. Even the sunlight filtering through the blinds felt sharper, almost accusing. Overnight, murmurs had circulated through family channels, calls between cousins, texts exchanged behind closed doors. It was clear that my decision to gift the condo to someone overlooked had stirred more than curiosity. It had shaken the perceived order. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed the subtle weight of anticipation pressing down on me. Questions that hadn't been asked aloud yet hovered in the air, and I knew the first direct confrontation was inevitable. The calm I had maintained in Part 6 now seemed fragile, like a thin veneer over brewing intensity. By mid-morning, a few relatives arrived at the house unannounced. They tried to appear casual, but their movements and glances betrayed an undercurrent of suspicion. Each conversation began lightly, only to circle around the condo and my choice. I noticed a repeated pattern. They probed for weakness, trying to catch an emotional misstep, expecting hesitation or regret. Instead, I maintained composure, listening more than speaking, letting their assumptions unravel naturally. The quiet power of deliberate silence became my ally, and I could sense their frustration growing. It was not an overt confrontation yet, but a slow, tense probing that carried more weight than a direct argument. As the afternoon progressed, the discussions grew sharper. One cousin, who had often been considered a mediator, attempted to convince me that the transfer had been impulsive and unfair. They spoke of precedent, tradition, and family expectations, all as if these principles outweighed reason and fairness. I found myself reflecting on how often familial dynamics reward conformity over justice, and how easily those overlooked can be dismissed. My responses were measured, not defensive, focused on clarifying intent rather than conceding ground. With each calm reply, I observed subtle shifts in their expressions, realization slowly replacing entitlement. Later, A more direct approach emerged. One of the elder relatives cornered me in the living room, asking pointed questions about my motivations. They spoke with a tone that implied accusation, yet beneath it was a clear fear of unpredictability. I realized that the condo had become more than property. It was now a symbol of autonomy, recognition, and the consequences of ignoring those who mattered less in the traditional hierarchy. My explanation emphasized fairness, recognition, and the overlooked individual, framing the decision as deliberate and final. The moment carried a strange gravity, every word measured, every pause meaningful. By evening, tension had started to ripple outward. Other relatives who had initially remained silent began calling and messaging, seeking to gauge reactions and influence outcomes indirectly. I resisted the temptation to over-explain, understanding that clarity often arises from patience rather than an immediate engagement. In reflection, I realized that my initial act, simple in its intent, had become a catalyst, forcing a web of relationships to adjust. The emotional complexity was palpable. I could sense their discomfort and growing understanding, the tension oscillating between resentment and reluctant admiration. As night fell, I took a quiet moment in the garden. The stars above seemed indifferent to family dynamics, their distant light offering perspective. I thought about the person who had received the condo, whose quiet acknowledgement had been more satisfying than any praise or approval I could have received from my relatives. Their gratitude highlighted the deeper implications of recognition and fairness, a reminder that acting with integrity often carries rewards that are invisible to others but profoundly felt by those affected. It reinforced my commitment to deliberate action over conformity and the subtle triumph of honoring someone previously forgotten. The evening ended with indirect confrontations through messages and a few lingering visits, all testing boundaries in subtle ways. I reflected on the nature of power within families, the assumptions, the silent hierarchies, the expectation of predictability. By acting differently, I had forced a reconsideration of these dynamics. I felt a growing sense of clarity and purpose, recognizing that even small gestures of fairness could destabilize entrenched patterns. It was not about winning arguments or asserting authority. It was about reshaping perception through deliberate choice. Before heading to bed, I reviewed the day's interactions, each encounter and message a reminder of the complexity of family ties. The condo had become more than a gift. It was a statement, a lesson in recognition, and an exercise in self-respect. I understood that tomorrow would likely bring further confrontations, but I also knew that these moments would be opportunities to reinforce fairness and clarity. The day closed with a quiet satisfaction, tempered by awareness that family dynamics would continue to evolve and that my actions, though deliberate and considered, had permanently shifted the landscape of relationships. The morning light felt heavier this time, almost as if it carried the weight of the conversations and tension from the previous day. I lingered at the window, coffee in hand, trying to organize my thoughts before facing what I sensed was coming. Overnight, whispers had spread further, and the subtle probes I'd felt earlier were now transforming into direct inquiries and thinly veiled criticisms. I realized that my choice, seemingly simple in intent, had become a fulcrum for old grievances and unspoken ambitions. There was no going back. Each conversation today would reveal the layers of family expectation, loyalty, and resentment that I had only glimpsed before. By mid-morning, messages started arriving from relatives who had previously been silent observers. They were curious, indirect, attempting to test my resolve, gauge reactions, or perhaps sway the outcome in subtle ways. Each note carried a tone that required careful interpretation. Compliments folded into hints of disapproval, inquiries disguised as concern. As I read them, I reflected on how family dynamics often masquerade as civility while hiding undercurrents of competition and entitlement. It was a lesson in patience and measured response, one that demanded emotional discipline and strategic clarity. Soon after, the first visitor arrived. One cousin who had appeared neutral until now entered the house with a calculated calmness. Their questions were courteous on the surface but carried the weight of probing insight, a careful attempt to unearth uncertainty. I noticed the almost imperceptible flinches, micro-expressions that betrayed curiosity and unease. With each measured response, I maintained control over the narrative, subtly demonstrating that my decision was intent, ional, and irreversible. I realized that the condo had become a symbol not of property, but of principles, fairness, and acknowledgement of the overlooked. My calm resolve contrasted sharply with their shifting emotions, quietly asserting a form of authority beyond traditional hierarchies. By afternoon, more relatives began arriving, some with smiles, others with restrained criticism. The pattern was clear. The condo's transfer had upset assumptions of entitlement and privilege. Conversations shifted, veiled threats mingling with awkward apologies, all testing boundaries. I listened carefully, aware that words now carried significance far beyond casual discussion. Each statement, each pause, offered insight into family motives and loyalties. I could see old alliances stretching thin, some bending toward understanding, others recoiling in resentment. The room felt charged, a subtle but persistent energy that promised escalation unless handled thoughtfully. Unexpectedly, one distant relative revealed a piece of family history I had not fully understood. It was a story about past inheritances, overlooked family members, and long-standing resentment. A narrative that shed new light on why the condo had become such a lightning rod. Listening quietly, I pieced together the context, old grievances, feelings of neglect and unspoken competition that had shaped current behaviors. It became clear that my act of recognition had not only rewarded the overlooked, but also disrupted the carefully maintained balance of expectation. The revelation felt like both confirmation and challenge. It affirmed the righteousness of my choice, while exposing the depth of familial complexity I would need to navigate. Later in the day, tensions escalated subtly but unmistakably. A few relatives engaged in pointed discussions among themselves, casting glances toward me, evaluating my reactions, testing for cracks. I realized that the condo had become more than a property issue. It was a mirror reflecting each person's values, ambitions, and insecurities. By remaining composed, I allowed their unease to surface naturally, reinforcing the principle that fairness and deliberate choice could unsettle long-held assumptions without confrontation. The room was thick with anticipation, each interaction layered with subtext and emotion. Evening brought a quieter moment, though tension lingered beneath the surface. I walked through the condo, reflecting on the person who had received it, their life subtly transformed by a single deliberate act of recognition. Their quiet gratitude contrasted with the simmering unrest elsewhere, reminding me that the significance of my decision extended beyond immediate reactions. It was an acknowledgement that some choices, even when misunderstood or challenged, carry enduring weight. In that moment, I felt a mix of satisfaction and apprehension, a recognition of the impact and an understanding that the next day would bring new challenges, questions, and tests of patience. As night approached, I considered how this series of interactions would influence long-term family dynamics. The condo had become a catalyst, revealing priorities, loyalties, and vulnerabilities. I understood that each conversation, each probing glance, would contribute to a reshaping of relationships, and that my role was not merely reactive, but intentionally guiding the narrative. The tension remained unresolved, but there was a quiet sense that clarity and respect could emerge from deliberate, principled action. Before bed, I reviewed the day's unfolding events, noting patterns, motives, and subtle shifts in attitude. I felt a growing sense of insight into the underlying currents of family power, entitlement, and recognition. The condo had become a lens through which both fairness and disruption could be observed, and I understood that patience, clarity, and composure were now essential tools. I allowed myself a moment of reflection, recognizing that while some challenges remained unresolved, the act of deliberate fairness had already begun to reshape expectations, and the next day would likely reveal new dimensions of both conflict and understanding. The next morning, I felt the lingering unease from yesterday pressing against me like a shadow that wouldn't lift. I knew that some conversations were inevitable, but I hadn't anticipated just how layered the subtle tests of loyalty and curiosity could be. Even before anyone arrived, I found myself replaying the interactions in my mind, examining micro-expressions, tones, and pauses that hinted at hidden agendas. The condo, once a simple act of recognition, had become a litmus test for every relative's intentions, and I sensed that today would reveal more than just reactions. It would expose motives. By mid-morning, a few relatives appeared together, their approach carefully orchestrated, almost as if rehearsed. Their smiles were polite but measured, and each question carried a subtle edge. They inquired about the condo's transfer, about my thought process, even about my future plans. Their words were layered with implied challenges, testing whether I was prepared to justify choices that unsettled expectations. I maintained calm, answering carefully, aware that every hesitation could be interpreted as doubt or weakness. Their reactions were revealing, a frown here, a slight pause there, an almost imperceptible tightening of posture, small cues that spoke volumes about the underlying tension. In one conversation, a cousin leaned in, voice low, and deliberate, hinting at past decisions that had gone unnoticed, trying to challenge the legitimacy of my choice. I listened intently, weighing responses, noting both the overt and covert messages. There was a quiet power in observing, in holding still while others revealed more than they intended. I realized that the condo had become more than property. It was a statement, a test of values and principles. Each relative's reaction reflected their alignment with fairness or entitlement, and the patterns were becoming increasingly clear. As noon approached, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Some relatives had begun to converse among themselves, their tones fluctuating between whispered speculation and careful probing. I felt the undercurrent of rivalry and curiosity, a dynamic that I had only glimpsed in passing before. It was astonishing how a single decision could illuminate hidden histories, unspoken resentments, and long-standing expectations. The condo was a catalyst, revealing fissures in relationships that had seemed stable until now. I found myself reflecting on how often family gatherings are a stage for subtle negotiation, competition, and assertion of unspoken hierarchies. An unexpected visitor arrived, someone I hadn't seen in years. Their presence added a new layer of complexity. They didn't hide their surprise or curiosity, asking pointed questions about why the condo had gone to someone overlooked rather than following traditional expectations. I noticed their eyes searching mine for uncertainty, for a crack in my reasoning that could be exploited. I held my composure, gently reminding them that recognition wasn't about tradition but about principle. Their reaction was a mix of frustration and grudging acknowledgement, a tension that mirrored the broader family dynamics now fully in motion. Later, during a quieter moment, I reflected on the nature of entitlement and overlooked contributions within families. My thoughts wandered to the person who had received the condo, imagining how they must feel, unaware of the subtle storms brewing around them. I felt a deep sense of responsibility, knowing that this act of recognition carried consequences far beyond my immediate intentions. Each encounter I had today, each carefully measured answer, would ripple outward, shaping perceptions and potentially altering long-standing expectations. I realized that true influence often comes not from confrontation, but from deliberate, principled action paired with calm patience. By late afternoon, tensions escalated, though still beneath the surface. Small confrontations began to surface, remarks disguised as curiosity, criticisms couched in politeness, and probing questions designed to test boundaries. I noticed that the condo had become a symbol of fairness and challenge simultaneously, forcing each relative to examine their assumptions. I responded with measured calm, aware that my own restraint was now part of the narrative, a silent assertion of authority and clarity. The energy in the room was subtle, yet undeniable, a web of interwoven emotions and expectations that demanded careful navigation. As the evening drew near, I paused to consider what had unfolded. Today had revealed the depth of hidden motivations, the fragility of assumed hierarchies, and the transformative power of a single, intentional decision. I recognized that the condo had become a mirror reflecting both the best and the most insecure aspects of my family. While some had shifted toward understanding, others recoiled, struggling with the disruption of long-held assumptions. I understood that patience, observation, and measured responses would be essential in maintaining balance, even as the undercurrents of tension promised future confrontations. Before heading to bed, I reviewed the day in my mind, noting key interactions and subtle changes in demeanor. I felt a growing awareness of the delicate balance between recognition and challenge, fairness and expectation. The condo had ignited questions, exposed motives, and shifted dynamics in ways I hadn't anticipated, yet it had also provided clarity about who truly valued principle over entitlement. I knew that the story was far from over, that tomorrow would bring new layers, new reactions, and perhaps moments of confrontation that would test both resolve and patience. The morning air felt heavier than usual, carrying the weight of unspoken conversations from the previous day. I sensed that some alliances were beginning to form quietly, subtle glances exchanged between relatives who shared the same questions and uncertainties about the condo. Their conversations, although seemingly casual, were laced with implications about entitlement, loyalty, and overlooked contributions. I observed from a distance, carefully noting the dynamics as they unfolded. The condo, which I had thought of simply as a gift, had become a lens through which hidden loyalties and rivalries were emerging. As relatives arrived, I noticed how easily the smallest remarks could shift the room's energy. A cousin casually mentioned the past, alluding to decisions I had made that now seemed to undermine traditional expectations. Their tone was deceptively light, but the words carried a challenge. I responded with measured calm, aware that a defensive reaction could escalate tensions. Instead, I let silence punctuate the conversation, allowing the undercurrents to surface naturally. Observing reactions in real time, I realized that this space had become a test of both patience and perception. Later, during a brief pause in the day, a conversation erupted that forced me to confront deeper questions about fairness and recognition. A relative, normally quiet, voiced frustration over being overlooked in family decisions. Their words, tinged with resentment, revealed how much unspoken expectation weighed on every interaction. I listened without interruption, aware that each carefully held response shaped perceptions more than any immediate argument could. In that moment, I recognized that giving the condo to someone forgotten was not just a personal act, but a catalyst for revealing long-buried assumptions within the family. By early afternoon, the tension had grown more palpable. Small groups began to converse privately, their hushed tones carrying the weight of strategic evaluation. I found myself reflecting on the subtle ways people negotiate status and influence within families. Even casual comments about the condo carried layers of meaning, and I realized that my decision was now inseparable from the family's social fabric. Each interaction became a study in human behavior, anticipating, reacting, testing limits, while I maintained a sense of calm authority, ensuring that my presence grounded the unfolding dynamics rather than inflaming them. Unexpectedly, one relative approached me directly, seeking a more intimate conversation. Their voice was gentle but probing, attempting to extract rationale, reasoning, and intent. I explained calmly why the gift had gone to someone often overlooked, emphasizing values of fairness and acknowledgement over tradition or expectation. Their expression shifted from suspicion to tentative understanding, but I could sense lingering doubt. I recognized that this was not merely about the condo. It was about long-standing perceptions, expectations, and the challenge of seeing beyond personal assumptions. As the afternoon stretched on, I observed a pattern emerging. Relatives were beginning to test each other, subtly asserting influence, and attempting to claim moral high ground. Some questioned my motives, others aligned quietly, and a few withdrew, their feelings unspoken but visible in posture and expression. I reflected on how a single action could illuminate both the nobility and insecurity in others. The condo had become a mirror, reflecting the nuances of family dynamics in stark clarity, and I realized that my choices were less about ownership and more about revealing truth. Later, I took a moment to step outside, seeking clarity in solitude. The quiet of the garden contrasted sharply with the subtle turbulence indoors. I allowed myself to reflect on the broader implications of the condo gift. It was a measure of principle against expectation, recognition against entitlement. I understood that while some would accept the decision gracefully, others would struggle to reconcile it with their sense of position and priority. Observing nature around me, I felt a quiet affirmation that actions rooted in integrity hold their own power, even amidst skepticism or resistance. By evening, subtle confrontations began to emerge more explicitly. Conversations turned to gentle criticisms disguised as questions, challenging both my authority and my reasoning. I navigated each with measured patience, careful phrasing, and attentive listening. Every word and gesture mattered, and I realized that maintaining composure while allowing others to reveal themselves was the most effective way to manage the shifting dynamics. The condo, once a simple transfer, had become a catalyst for examining family structures, challenging assumptions, and affirming values through careful observation and restraint. As night fell, I reviewed the day's interactions and observed the evolving landscape of alliances, loyalties, and emerging tensions. The condo's gift had initiated a ripple effect, revealing both unspoken conflicts and unexpected alignments. I reflected on how my deliberate choice had not only recognized someone overlooked, but had also exposed the deeper layers of relational dynamics. I knew that tomorrow would bring further clarity, additional confrontations, and moments of reckoning that would demand equal measures of patience, insight, and resolve. Before retreating for the night, I allowed myself a quiet moment of introspection. The condo, though material in nature, had transcended its physical value to become a symbol of principles, fairness, and the revelation of character. I felt the growing awareness that family dynamics are never just about property or inheritance. They are a reflection of choices, integrity, and the courage to act in alignment with one's values. With this understanding, I prepared for the days ahead, knowing that each interaction would continue to reveal truths previously hidden beneath polite facades. The morning light filtered through the curtains, soft and indifferent to the tension I felt stirring inside. After yesterday's subtle confrontations, I could already anticipate how today would unfold. Each step into the family gathering carried a sense of cautious preparation, a quiet calculation of words and gestures, as though walking a narrow path stretched taut between expectation and principle. I reminded myself that my choice to gift the condo to someone often overlooked was both a statement and a test, a quiet challenge to the family's unspoken hierarchies. The moment I entered, eyes followed, curious and measuring. The subtle shifts in posture, the brief pauses before greetings, and the careful selection of words revealed unspoken alliances forming and fractures widening. One cousin, in particular, seemed unsettled, repeatedly glancing toward the recipient of the gift as if searching for justification. I maintained my composure, allowing the tension to linger without attempting to fill it, understanding that clarity often emerges in the silence between words. During a break in the conversation, I found myself reflecting on the choices that led me here. There had been no impulsive decision. Every action was calculated, intended to acknowledge those overlooked while gently disrupting ingrained expectations. Yet witnessing the ripple effect on those around me revealed the unpredictability of human nature. Small gestures, once unnoticed, became amplified in significance, and even casual comments carried the weight of perceived judgment or approval. By midday, a discussion emerged that forced me to navigate the terrain of expectation and resentment simultaneously. A relative, carefully masking displeasure with a neutral tone, questioned the timing of the gift. "Why now?" they asked, eyes narrowed but voice calm. I responded thoughtfully, outlining the principles behind my choice, without defensiveness. It became clear that my explanation mattered less than the act itself, which had already begun reshaping perceptions and relationships. Later, I observed an unexpected alliance forming quietly. A pair of relatives, previously distant, began to converse with the gift recipient, their demeanor noticeably less guarded. I sensed an undercurrent of curiosity and cautious respect, perhaps inspired by the principle I had applied rather than the gift itself. This subtle shift reminded me that influence often flows indirectly, through demonstration rather than assertion, and that integrity has its own resonance, even among skeptics. During the afternoon, I was approached for a private conversation by someone whose opinion I had always valued. Their voice carried a mix of concern and admiration, attempting to understand the deeper reasoning behind the gift. I explained my intention to honor those overlooked, emphasizing fairness and recognition over traditional entitlement. Their response was thoughtful, and I could see a subtle shift in their perception, not complete agreement, but a willingness to question previous assumptions. As the day progressed, I noticed a ripple effect in how family members engaged with each other. Conversations became more reflective, with hints of reevaluation and subtle acknowledgement of unspoken truths. It was clear that my decision had sparked a reassessment of values and priorities, challenging long-held beliefs about recognition and inheritance. Observing this transformation, I realized that the act of gifting was less about the condo itself and more about catalyzing awareness, insight, and reflection among those present. By late afternoon, tensions that had hovered beneath the surface began to reveal themselves more openly. Questions, previously framed as casual conversation, became more pointed, challenging both the recipient and me. I responded with patience, careful phrasing, and deliberate calm, understanding that measured responses often reveal character more than immediate arguments. Each interaction reinforced the idea that principles rooted in fairness have consequences that extend beyond the initial act, affecting perceptions, relationships, and long-term dynamics. As evening approached, I found a quiet moment to reflect on the unfolding day. The condo, once a simple material gift, had transformed into a lens for evaluating family dynamics, exposing assumptions, alliances, and latent rivalries. The reactions of those around me, some supportive, some resistant, underscored the complex interplay between expectation and principle. I understood that the act itself was only the beginning. The unfolding responses, interactions, and emerging truths would shape the family for years to come. In the final moments of the day, I observed a pattern of subtle reconciliation. Certain relatives who had initially been skeptical began engaging more openly, asking questions and listening to perspectives previously overlooked. While not every tension was resolved, there was a perceptible shift toward understanding prompted by the act of inclusion and recognition. I recognized that my decision, though controversial to some, had initiated meaningful dialogue, reflection, and insight, proof that deliberate choices grounded in integrity carry influence far beyond immediate reactions. Before retiring for the evening, I allowed myself a quiet acknowledgement of the day's lessons. The condo gift, seemingly simple, had unveiled hidden truths, challenged assumptions, and sparked reflection in ways I could not have anticipated. I felt a growing certainty that acting with fairness and recognition, even when it disrupts established norms, ultimately reveals character, fosters insight, and cultivates long-term understanding. The family's responses would continue to unfold, but the principles guiding my actions had proven resilient, shaping both perception and reality. The next morning, I arrived with the faint hum of anticipation, a subtle reminder that the previous day's events were far from settled. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the warmth anchor me, but my mind was already tracing the patterns of reaction I had witnessed. The ripple of surprise, quiet resentment, and tentative respect from yesterday had left threads hanging, threads I needed to observe before the tension either resolved or escalated. I knew the impact of gifting the condo was far from over. It was only just beginning to test the boundaries of expectation and loyalty within the family. I decided to take a walk through the small garden behind the house, a space that had always offered me clarity. The morning air carried the faint scent of earth and early blooms, and I found myself reflecting on the subtle judgments that had surfaced during yesterday's gathering. The quiet whispers, the slight narrowing of eyes, the careful adjustments in posture, all had revealed more than words ever could. I realized that my choice to give the condo to someone overlooked was not just an act of fairness, but a catalyst, forcing the family to confront patterns of neglect and unspoken favoritism. As I returned indoors, I overheard snippets of conversations that confirmed my intuition. A distant cousin, previously indifferent, was quietly defending the recipient of the gift to others. Their tone was cautious but firm, a sign that the impact of my decision was already reshaping perceptions. The dynamics I had observed were evolving organically, as those who had initially resisted now had to reconsider their assumptions. It was an intricate dance of human nature where actions spoke louder than explanations and silence carried more weight than commentary. By midday, a family meeting had been subtly convened. The discussion initially centered around mundane updates, but it quickly shifted to the implications of my decision. Questions arose, testing both the reasoning and timing of the gift. I listened more than I spoke, allowing the conversation to unfold naturally, recognizing that influence often arrives quietly, through observation rather than persuasion. My calm presence became a grounding force, even as underlying tensions whispered in the background, reminding everyone that some boundaries were meant to be questioned. One interaction stood out, a conversation with a relative who had been silently critical throughout. They asked pointedly why I had chosen this moment to act, their voice measured but charged with curiosity. I explained gently but decisively that the choice was about acknowledgement and equity rather than timing or expectation. The subtle shift in their posture, the softening around their eyes, signaled that they were beginning to reconsider long-held assumptions. I understood that true resolution often arrives gradually through reflection, observation, and small revelations. Afternoon conversations revealed further complexity. Some family members struggled with accepting the gift without openly expressing dissent, while others quietly aligned themselves with the recipient, drawn by the principle of recognition. I noticed the delicate balance of empathy, rivalry, and moral reasoning shaping interactions around the room. These subtle shifts fascinated me, emphasizing how a single act of fairness could ripple through relationships, unearthing both latent tensions and emerging understanding. Later, I found myself reflecting on my motivations and the deeper implications of my actions. The condo was more than a property. It had become a prism through which family dynamics were refracted. Each response, each whispered opinion, each slight nod of approval or subtle frown contributed to a mosaic of insight. I realized that my goal had never been to create immediate harmony, but to spark reflection, challenge assumptions, and foster a deeper awareness of neglected connections. By evening, the initial shock of my decision had begun to mellow into a cautious dialogue. Some relatives had approached the recipient privately, offering support, questions, and tentative admiration. Others remained skeptical, their silence heavy with unspoken doubt. Yet even that quiet resistance revealed engagement, a willingness to consider perspectives previously overlooked. The impact of a single deliberate choice had begun to unfold like a slow wave, shaping relationships, revealing character, and creating opportunities for reconciliation and understanding. As night fell, I took a moment to journal my observations, the words flowing with clarity and purpose. I noted the subtle transformations, the moments of self-reflection I had witnessed, and the tentative gestures of acknowledgement that hinted at deeper changes to come. It was a reminder that principles, when applied with thoughtfulness and integrity, often generate outcomes that extend far beyond immediate perception. Even moments of conflict carry the seeds of understanding when approached with patience and intentionality. Before retiring for the night, I allowed myself a quiet recognition of the day's lessons. The condo, once a simple material object, had become a vehicle for insight, awareness, and evolving family dynamics. I sensed that while the path ahead would remain intricate and occasionally fraught, the foundation laid by this act of deliberate fairness would guide future interactions, reshaping perceptions and opening doors to deeper understanding. The family, much like the gift itself, was slowly learning that recognition and inclusion carry consequences far more profound than material value alone. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, carrying with it a quiet sense of anticipation. I sat at the kitchen table, notebook in hand, reflecting on the subtle shifts I had noticed over the past few days. The gift of the condo, an act I had expected to provoke only shock, had instead opened a labyrinth of observation and reflection. Each family member's reaction revealed layers I had not fully anticipated, some defensive, some unexpectedly introspective, and others quietly admiring. I realized that giving away something tangible had revealed something far more elusive: the values, priorities, and hidden biases embedded within those closest to me. I decided to take a short walk before the family reconvened, hoping to untangle my own thoughts before diving back into the web of relationships. The crisp air seemed to carry clarity, and with each step I revisited the conversations from yesterday. A cousin who had initially resisted my choice now lingered in the background, quietly assessing the reactions of others. Their hesitation spoke volumes, a tension between ingrained assumptions and a dawning awareness of fairness. I marveled at how a single gesture, seemingly straightforward, could expose such deep-seated attitudes, testing loyalty and morality in ways that mere words never could. Returning to the house, I noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere. The recipient of the condo moved with newfound confidence, small smiles exchanged with those who had previously ignored or overlooked them. These micro-expressions were small but potent, indicators of a shift that I had set in motion, even without directly managing outcomes. I found myself observing the balance of influence and perception, noting how actions could ripple outward, creating change that was both unpredictable and inevitable. The quiet recalibration of relationships fascinated me, revealing an intricate interplay of ego, expectation, and ethical awakening. By midday, a more structured discussion had formed among the relatives. The dialogue started with practical questions about the gift, but it inevitably expanded into deeper territory. Who deserved recognition, whose efforts had been overlooked, and how fairness was defined within the family. I listened carefully, letting their voices unfold without interruption. It was a delicate act, understanding that the influence of a decision is often more enduring when it is discovered organically rather than imposed. I sensed that some minds had begun to shift, even if outwardly resistance lingered. A conversation with an aunt who had always preferred appearances over authenticity struck me. She approached with measured words, attempting to reconcile her disapproval with curiosity. I offered no justification beyond the principle that had guided me, acknowledgement of the overlooked. Her initial surprise softened into thoughtful reflection, and I realized that she, like others, was confronting not just the gift, but the underlying values it represented. It was clear that the condo had become a symbol far beyond its physical presence. It was now a mirror, reflecting both the flaws and potentials of those around me. The afternoon brought another layer of tension. Some family members began strategizing, questioning how their own actions or omissions might be perceived in the future. Whispered conversations hinted at envy, pride, and unresolved competition. Yet simultaneously, small gestures of connection and recognition were emerging, showing that even within conflict, empathy could surface. I observed these interactions with a quiet patience, understanding that human nature often requires time to process revelations, especially when those revelations disrupt familiar hierarchies and expectations. I spent a portion of the afternoon with the recipient, who shared a mixture of relief and uncertainty. They had not anticipated the scrutiny or the delicate balancing act required to navigate family dynamics after receiving such a significant gift. I encouraged them to remain true to themselves, emphasizing that the value of the gift lay not in ownership, but in the acknowledgement it represented. Their gratitude was quiet but genuine, a reminder that acts of fairness and recognition can yield profound emotional resonance, even when met with initial resistance from others. Evening approached with a sense of calm tension. I found a quiet corner to reflect on the unfolding days, recording observations and noting patterns of change. The family's reactions were varied, revealing both the fragility and resilience of human relationships. Some members had begun to reevaluate their assumptions, while others maintained a cautious distance, signaling that acceptance and trust formation are gradual processes. I realized that my act of giving had been less about property and more about creating opportunities for growth, reflection, and ethical engagement. As night settled, I felt a quiet satisfaction mixed with anticipation. The gift had catalyzed discussions, reflections, and subtle shifts that I knew would continue to unfold long after the immediate attention faded. Each interaction, whether tense, awkward, or unexpectedly tender, contributed to a broader understanding of responsibility, recognition, and fairness. I understood that influence is most enduring when it is indirect, thoughtful, and principled, shaping not only actions, but perspectives. Before retiring, I revisited the day's conversations in my journal, piecing together insights about resilience, morality, and family dynamics. The condo, once a tangible asset, had become a lens through which behavior, loyalty, and values were revealed. I recognized that while the journey ahead might still include resistance, doubt, and occasional friction, the foundational shift was already in motion. The choices we make, even quietly and deliberately, ripple outward, shaping perception, challenging assumptions, and redefining relationships. The morning air felt heavy with expectation, almost as if the house itself sensed the delicate balance between tension and understanding. I awoke earlier than usual, reflecting on the past 2 weeks and the ripple effects of gifting the condo. Every interaction, every glance, seemed to carry new meaning. The small upheaval I had initiated had shifted the emotional currents in ways that were invisible yet palpable. I poured a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching neighbors pass by, thinking about how seemingly minor gestures can illuminate long-neglected truths within our closest relationships. The first conversation of the day arrived unexpectedly. A cousin who had previously been dismissive approached cautiously. Their words were measured, almost hesitant, as if testing the waters of a relationship that had been quietly strained. They spoke about fairness, recognition, and accountability, not accusing, but probing. I listened, allowing them the space to articulate their thoughts, realizing that dialogue is often the precursor to true understanding. The condo, once merely an asset, had become a catalyst for reflection and moral consideration, forcing everyone to confront not only my choices but their own. Later, a quiet observation revealed itself during the family gathering. I noticed the recipient of the condo moving among relatives with a newfound self-assurance but not arrogance. Their confidence seemed to inspire subtle shifts in demeanor around them. Some relatives softened, others became contemplative, while a few remained visibly uneasy. The dynamics were complex, layered with historical tension, pride, and unspoken judgments. Yet the act of giving had introduced an element of accountability that no argument or explanation could achieve. It was remarkable to see how a single, deliberate action could serve as both mirror and magnifying glass, revealing both virtues and flaws. By mid-afternoon, the discussions had taken on an unexpectedly philosophical tone. Conversations about fairness evolved into reflections on values, legacy, and the ways we acknowledge each other's efforts. Aunts and uncles debated quietly, not just about the property itself, but about what it represented. A recognition of diligence, patience, and integrity that had often been overlooked. I realized that my initial goal, simply to redirect attention to someone overlooked, had expanded into a broader moral exploration. It was clear that influence, when exercised thoughtfully, often extends beyond immediate expectations, shaping perception and ethical reflection. Later, I took a brief walk alone, processing the subtle yet undeniable changes I observed. The shift in family dynamics was neither immediate nor absolute, but it was real. I reflected on the complexity of human relationships, the way small actions can trigger deep emotional responses, sometimes uncovering hidden resentments or unspoken admiration. It struck me that gifts, particularly unexpected ones, are rarely about the object itself. They are about what the object represents and how it interacts with the hidden architecture of feelings and memory. Each nod, each quiet acknowledgement carried a weight I had not fully anticipated. Returning to the house, I found the atmosphere had changed in small but significant ways. Conversations flowed more openly, laughter appeared at moments where tension had previously lingered, and a few long-standing grievances were subtly addressed. The condo had become an instrument of moral clarity, a lens through which each person's response revealed their priorities and values. I noted with quiet satisfaction that even the most resistant relatives were beginning to recognize, if not yet admit, the fairness of my decision. It was a lesson in patience and restraint, demonstrating that meaningful change rarely occurs in an instant. The evening brought with it a reflective calm. Sitting alone in the study, I revisited the day's observations in my journal. patterns emerged. Who resisted, who adapted, who quietly embraced the new equilibrium. I understood that the gift had acted as a trigger for self-assessment among relatives, provoking internal dialogue that might never have occurred otherwise. It was remarkable how an external gesture could stimulate such profound internal reflection, reminding me that ethical influence is as much about perception as it is about action. As night approached, the recipient of the condo came to me quietly, sharing a mix of gratitude and concern. They had experienced the subtle social currents firsthand, navigating praise, envy, and curiosity simultaneously. I offered reassurance, reminding them that the true value of the gift was not in ownership, but in acknowledgement and visibility. Their relief was palpable, tempered with the awareness that human dynamics are complicated and often unpredictable. I marveled at how the simple act of giving could cultivate both empowerment and reflection simultaneously. Before retiring for the night, I reflected on the broader implications of the gift. I recognized that influence is rarely direct or immediate. It unfolds gradually, often revealing itself through behavior, dialogue, and subtle shifts in perception. The condo had become more than a property. It had evolved into a prism through which the moral and emotional landscape of my family could be viewed, understood, and perhaps realigned. It was clear that the act of giving, carefully considered and intentionally executed, has the power to reshape not just relationships but perspectives and priorities. Finally, as I closed my journal, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction mingled with anticipation. The days ahead would continue to test, challenge, and ultimately reveal the depth of character within my family. The condo, a tangible gift, had become an agent of subtle but meaningful transformation, reminding me that acts of integrity often speak louder than words, and that fairness, once acknowledged, can ripple outward in unforeseen yet enduring ways. The morning light streamed through the windows, carrying a calmness that felt almost surreal after weeks of subtle tension and shifting dynamics. I sat with a cup of coffee, reflecting on how the act of gifting the condo had altered not just my relationships, but the very atmosphere in which those relationships existed. The initial act, so simple, almost impulsive, had triggered a cascade of realizations, confrontations, and quiet acknowledgments. It had begun as a way to recognize someone forgotten, overlooked in the usual familial hierarchies, and it had blossomed into a profound lesson in influence, morality, and presence. Conversations that morning felt different, almost tentative in their honesty. Relatives who had once been dismissive approached me with questions that were both personal and reflective. They wanted to understand the reasoning behind my choice, not out of suspicion, but from curiosity and a newfound respect. It was striking to see how a single decision could reshape perceptions and invite self-examination. I realized then that family dynamics, often entrenched in old patterns, are remarkably malleable when confronted with deliberate and transparent action. The condo, while material in essence, had become a tool for introspection and growth. As the day progressed, small gestures of reconciliation emerged. Apologies were offered, not grandiose but quiet and meaningful, acknowledging moments of neglect or oversight. Others, more resistant, remained watchful, testing the stability of this new balance. Observing them, I understood that change in human relationships is rarely immediate. It unfolds gradually, marked by subtle shifts in tone, body language, and choice of words. The condo, once a point of contention, had transformed into a bridge, a symbol that recognition and fairness can be delivered thoughtfully, even when past tensions linger. Later, I spent time alone, reflecting on the moral weight of my actions. Giving away something significant without expectation of gratitude had shifted my own perspective. I saw the family not as a series of potential conflicts, but as a network of interwoven stories, ambitions, and vulnerabilities. The gift had illuminated hidden truths: who valued integrity, who harbored unspoken envy, and who was willing to reconsider long-held assumptions. It struck me how much insight can be gained from observing reactions to generosity, especially when that generosity disrupts old hierarchies and expectations. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere had softened considerably. Conversations became more open, and even those initially skeptical of my decision began to show signs of reflection. Laughter returned to moments once strained, and I sensed a quiet curiosity about what other subtle gestures might reshape our family interactions. The condo had not only altered ownership, but had initiated a chain of moral and emotional inquiry, compelling everyone to examine their assumptions about fairness, recognition, and responsibility. It was a reminder that tangible actions often speak louder than words, particularly when they illuminate values that have been neglected. In the evening, the recipient of the condo approached me privately. Their gratitude was evident, but tempered with the awareness of the scrutiny and subtle challenges they had encountered. We spoke candidly about the experience, the hesitations, the reactions, and the shifts in perception. I reassured them that the true power of the gift lay not in possession, but in acknowledgement of effort, character, and the overlooked role they had always played. Their relief was palpable, a mix of validation and cautious optimism about the days ahead. As night fell, I reflected on the cumulative impact of the past weeks. The condo had acted as both catalyst and mirror, forcing me and my relatives to confront unspoken truths and hidden biases. I recognized that influence, when executed with intention and clarity, can reveal character and foster growth in ways discussion alone cannot. The family dynamics, though not perfect, were fundamentally altered, imbued with an awareness that fairness and recognition matter more than pride or habitual dismissal. Finally, I documented my reflections in the journal that had accompanied me through this journey. I noted patterns, responses, and moments of insight, small victories that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. The condo had done more than transfer property. It had created space for reflection, reconciliation, and moral clarity. I understood that meaningful gestures, even when simple, possess the power to catalyze change, inspire accountability, and strengthen connections. It was a quiet triumph, subtle yet profound, the kind that lingers long after the moment of action has passed. Before turning in for the night, I felt a deep sense of closure mingled with anticipation. Relationships would continue to evolve, influenced by the awareness and insight this experience had sparked. The condo, now a symbol rather than just a possession, would serve as a reminder that thoughtful actions ripple outward, shaping not only perception, but behavior and morality. I slept with the quiet confidence that fairness and intentionality, once demonstrated, have the power to inspire both reflection and transformation, leaving an enduring legacy within those we hold closest. I never imagined that standing up for myself could feel this quiet, yet so powerful. Every choice I made, from gifting the condo to someone unexpected, wasn't just about property. It was about reclaiming my voice, asserting my dignity, and proving that respect can't be demanded. It must be earned. I learned that family ties don't always follow a straight path, and sometimes the most unexpected gestures teach the harshest lessons. What mattered most was that I held on to my sense of self even when others tried to rewrite the rules around me. Life has a way of testing patience, boundaries, and the courage to act with integrity. And today I can say I met those tests without losing sight of who I am. If you've ever wondered how subtle actions can shift the balance of respect and power within a family, there's another story that delves even deeper into that delicate line between trust and betrayal. It explores what happens when someone you've overlooked steps into the center of the room, challenging everything you thought you controlled. Keep watching to see how those quiet confrontations can redefine the meaning of legacy and empowerment. You won't want to miss what happens next.